under a lot of material. Last topic today. Okay, so as you saw me scrolling, we've done a lot of stuff. We are now on to our last topic before your exam, which is next week. So, yep. So we'll be finishing up the female reproductive system today and Friday, and I'll have a review Monday, and I believe your exam is Wednesday, and then next Friday will be a review for the final. Okay. So picking up with quicker. Okay, so we're going to start really this whole section of the reproductive system is going to be centered around cyclical variations of hormones and how they affect different parts of the female reproductive system. So cycling is going to be really important for us. So the female reproductive system is characterized by these cyclic changes in activity, which you are all adults, so hopefully you know that by now. Women have a menstrual cycle, usually under normal conditions. There are restricted periods of fertility in females, so this is a difference from the male reproductive system, which is constant on average from day to day. So we're going to have restricted periods of fertility during ovulation and surrounding that time period. Another difference from the male reproductive system is that we're going to have limited gamete production in females. So there are a limited number of egg cells, basically, a pool that you're born with. This pool is established at birth, and then you run through them throughout the course of your life. If you are a female, when they run out, they run out. So we're going to be talking about how that happens. But when we look at the production of mature ova, so mature egg cells, we're going to see that parts of that are going to look kind of like the parts of meiosis we look through in the male reproductive system. So parts are going to be different, specifically for this reason. The professor in college used to lock the door when he started talking. It's horrible. That is not locked. I'm sure you know by now. Okay. So when we're looking at the female reproductive organs, we're often going to be talking about follicles. So hopefully in lab, maybe you saw some ovaries. Did you see them? I don't know about the state of the bodies. Did everybody have hysterectomies in there? Okay. In that case, we will look at this a little more closely then. Okay. So here we have the uterus. And here we have the ovaries out to the side. And if you were to zoom in on an ovary, you'd see that there are tons and tons of little follicles inside. So these are what are set in number at birth. Each follicle has within it one ovum. So that's the technical word for our egg cell. So these are going to be developing in the ovary. And they're going to start out as something called a primordial follicle. So that's what we have circled here, these little dots. As you can also see from this image, what we're going to be talking about is how these follicles develop eventually to release a mature ova. So another word for an ovum at this stage is an oocyte. So kind of like we talked about spermatocytes on Monday, an oocyte is an ovum at this stage. The ovum, or the oocyte, is going to start to have this layer of cells surrounding it expand. So these granulosa cells surrounding the ovum expand as the oocyte develops. So that's what we can see in this sort of first stage of growth. Okay. So the thing about the granulosa cells is these are target cells. So they have receptors for estrogen and FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. So these are follicles that are getting stimulated to grow. So the granulosa cells, when they receive these signals from the estrogen and the FSH, they're going to secrete chemical messengers in response that are going to continue the development and maturation of that ovum. The other thing that they're going to do is they're going to secrete something called inhibin, which, as its name suggests, just like we saw in males, inhibin is going to provide us a negative feedback loop. So we're starting out making this ovum develop with estrogen and FSH, but as the cell grows, as this granulosa cell layer grows, it's looping back, doing negative feedback, turning off that initial FSH signal. So it's providing negative feedback on the secretion of FSH. The granulosa cells, if we look at them from like a cellular perspective, what they're doing is they're transporting nutrients to those oocytes. So between them, we'd see a lot of gap junctions because we're separated from the blood flow here. So we do need to allow various nutrients to get into the follicle and get to that developing egg. They are also secreting estrogen of their own. So they are target cells for estrogen and FSH, but they're also making estrogens. And that's going to be important when later on, as we're kind of pulling everything together, we look at how different levels of different hormones change throughout the female reproductive cycle. I do find that these hormones make more sense when you look at them all together in graph form. So be aware that these are kind of like a teaser for when we look at that graph. So when we're talking about the development of the gametes in the female reproductive system, we're going to want to separate out when in life we're talking about. So this is different than when we were looking at the male reproductive system, because parts of this are actually happening during fetal development. So parts of this are happening before birth, which is why there are a limited number of ova during adult life. So this meiosis starts during development. Okay. So we start with the oogonia. So these are the progenitor cells, so the first cells that are going to ultimately undergo meiosis and make our gametes. So that gonia ending is telling us that this is the first part, these first cells. Right? So in males, we saw that they were continually producing the spermatogonia, so they were splitting and sort of regenerating those cells. That's not happening in females. What instead is happening is the oogonia are splitting and creating our primary oocytes. And this picture has meiotic arrest happening before meiosis one, but it's actually like sort of right in the first few stages during prophase, but you don't need to know that. Okay, so there's this period of meiotic arrest where these cells are beginning to undergo meiosis, but they don't complete it. They just pause. They get stuck here until we're in this menstrual cycle and the ova start to develop. So this is why we're referring to those developing cells inside the follicles as oocytes instead of oogonia, because they're in this phase specifically. So meiosis, kind of cool. This is a little different than when you talked about meiosis probably in your earlier classes, partially because of this meiotic arrest phase, but also we have another sort of pause here. Ova are only going to undergo meiosis 2 if they get fertilized. So this meiosis 2 phase, this final production of the gametes only happens after fertilization. So we have a lot of different pauses in the development of these cells in the female reproductive system. So when we think about the menstrual cycle as a whole, we are thinking about meiosis and the development of those ova, but we can also think about it in the context of sort of two separate subcycles. They're going to be linked to each other because they're both responses to hormone changes. But if we're trying to observe them, we're going to be looking different places and they're going to have different divisions. So we're going to be looking at changes in the ovaries. So we're going to look at the ovarian cycle. which is going to have two distinct parts, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. We're going to go through those in detail. But we're also going to have changes in the uterus. So we're also going to have a separate uterine cycle, which we could plot relative to the ovarian cycle, but it's not going to have the same sort of divisions. They are both going to be responding, though, to changes in estrogen and progesterone concentrations. So we want to pay particular attention to the estrogen and the progesterone as we talk about this ovarian cycle first, because it's also going to play a role in controlling the uterine cycle, which we'll talk about right after. So when we're looking at the ovaries, we're zoomed in here on a follicle, and we can split the menstrual cycle roughly in half. So overall, our ovarian cycle, our menstrual cycle, is roughly 28 days. We split it right in half, follicular phase for 14 days, luteal phase for 14 days. And ovulation is that division point. So ovulation is happening here right around day 14. So that's why we split it up here. So during the follicular phase, note day 1, we're going to count as the beginning of menstruation. So this would be the first day we start to see shedding of the uterine lining. So the first day a woman can get her period, that's day 1 here. So follicular phase is beginning with menstruation and then continues to ovulation. And then the luteal phase, after ovulation, running just up until menstruation begins. So that's sort of our beginning thinking about how we're going to link it to the uterine cycle. Okay. So during this follicular phase, what we're paying attention to is development of that primordial follicle and how it grows and grows and grows up until ovulation. So this is under the control of FSH, that follicle stimulating hormone, and estrogens. So they're doing what they say. They are stimulating follicular growth. So the follicle is getting bigger and it's developing, and we see new cell layers and some new structures we can name developing throughout the follicular phase. Now, when we think about ovulation, we think about just one ovum, maybe 2 being released, which is true. But a kind of cool thing that's happening is we actually have multiple follicles developing early during the follicular phase. So they're kind of in a race. We're going to end up with one primary follicle that is growing faster than the others, that is more responsive to the hormones, which is why we ultimately only have one cell being released during ovulation. But we're going to see multiple follicles at different sort of stages of growth if we were to like zoom in and do an ultrasound of an ovary. So an oocyte is growing, so that first cell growing, and we start to see the granulosa cells proliferating. And so our oocyte is in the center, that little purple part, granulosa cells, this brown part around them. So we can see that that's getting larger. Next phase we're going to have is we're going to have something called the Zona pellucida forming. And they drew it a little early, I think. So it should be the purple layer surrounding this little oocyte. We're going to have the antrum, which is basically a big vacuole. So this is this big sort of fluid-filled pocket, which ultimately is going to have to burst in order for ovulation to occur. That's why that's forming. Okay. So this is that bit about the dominant follicle. So we have many primordial follicles starting to respond to FSH and estrogen, like a handful of them, not like 50 of them, maybe 1 to 20 or something like that. Okay, so we have a bunch of them developing. One of them develops faster than the others and is able to continue to produce estrogen even while the FSH levels are declining. So it continues to develop, whereas the remaining follicles, so the other ones that were starting to grow, start to regress and they eventually die off. So they are actually never ovulated, they're never used, they just die off. So you can't reuse them after they start to develop during one phase of the menstrual cycle. So if we're looking at the dominant follicle, we're going to see that then a structure called the corona radiata is developing. So corona, like crown, it's this layer of cells that ultimately during ovulation kind of looks like a crown surrounding the egg cell. At the point that we have a mature follicle that has undergone all these phases, we start to call it a Graphene follicle. So that's just another word for this mature follicle, this dominant follicle that has continued growing. At the end of the follicular phase, we have ovulation occurring. What's happening here is that antrum, so that fluid-filled sac, it's been getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it bursts, and it pushes out our egg cell, our ovum, our oocyte, pushes it to the surface of the ovary, so it can enter the fallopian tubes and flow to the uterus. So if we're thinking about the hormones involved here, so we've talked about we need FSH and we need estrogen in order to promote the growth of those follicles. In order to have ovulation occur, we're also paying attention to some pituitary hormones. We're paying attention to gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. We're paying attention to something called luteinizing hormone, LH. So what actually causes the bursting of the antrum and ovulation is a sudden surge in LH. So we're going to see a spike in LH right before ovulation that triggers this change. Okay. It's called luteinizing hormone because what we're going to enter next is the luteal phase, and this is going to be called the corpus luteum. So luteinizing hormone is sending us into the luteal phase. So as we enter the luteal phase, we've ruptured our follicle, so we've released this ovum, but the rest of this tissue is still here in the ovary. So it doesn't immediately die off. It doesn't just sort of regress the way our follicles that didn't continue growing did. What it does is instead, it turns into a gland. So that's why they changed the color of it, because we always like to draw glands kind of yellow. You see they look kind of yellow in real bodies. So this tissue has turned into the corpus luteum gland. But it's going to now secrete the hormones estrogen and progesterone. So that's the purpose of the gland. Sorry about that. Okay. So during the luteal phase, we're going to see estrogen and progesterone levels present, and we're going to see changes as the corpus luteum dies off eventually. It's going to reach its maximum activity in about 10 days. So it's going to spend 10 days secreting estrogen and progesterone, and then it's going to start to degenerate if we have not had a fertilization event. Okay. So during this luteolysis, so that's the dying off of the corpus luteum, you can see it getting smaller over time, right? As it's dying off, can't secrete as much estrogen and progesterone. So we're going to see these levels of estrogen and progesterone dropping. And ultimately, that's what's going to trigger menstruation, is the decrease in these levels of hormones. So the end of the luteal phase happens as this corpus luteum dies off and menstruation begins. And as menstruation begins, we jump straight back into the follicular phase with a new little pool of developing primordial follicles. Now, if the oocyte is fertilized, the corpus luteum doesn't actually degenerate for a while. Hormones, HCG, coming from the placenta and the developing embryo are going to keep that corpus luteum alive for a fair bit into pregnancy. So this is what happens if there's no fertilization. Okay. So let's take a look at this kind of all together in a different form. I like when pictures look a little more anatomical. So here we have our whole ovary. So here's our primordial follicle, little ones, and we're drawing in a group of them because we have a group of them that start to develop during any particular menstrual cycle, any individual cycle. So as they're growing, they're developing granulosa cells. And they're also developing an outer layer called theca cells, which are helping to kind of modulate responses to hormones. We can see the oocyte in the center, and we can see this Zona pellucida forming around the outside of the oocyte. We can see the antrum developing, so that vacuole filled with fluid. As it starts to circle around the oocyte, we're forming this kind of crown shape of tissue around the oocyte, which is ultimately going to break off and be released with the oocyte during ovulation. Here. And then we see the corpus luteum forming from our ruptured follicle. You can kind of see the edges of that actually here in this image. And as it starts to die off, eventually we're going to rename it the corpus albicans right at the end before we cycle back to the beginning. Okay. So that brings us to the uterine cycle. So the uterine cycle can be mapped on to the ovarian cycle because they're both responses to hormones. But we can see that we have 3 phases to the uterine cycle instead of just 2, like we saw in the ovarian cycle. So the first 2 phases of the uterine cycle are the menstrual phase. So that would be when bleeding occurs, and then the proliferative phase, where we're going to see a part of the uterus called the endometrium is going to be growing. So the menstrual phase is days 1 to 5 approximately. Proliferative phase is going to be after menstruation ends, so maybe day 5-ish through to day 14, or whenever we have ovulation. So these 2 phases correspond to the follicular phase. And then we're going to have the secretory phase, which is going to happen after ovulation, so during the luteal phase. So 2 parts map onto the growing follicles, 1 part maps onto the luteal phase. And we really want to remember that menstruation is actually at the beginning, not at the end of these cycles. So the beginning of the uterine cycle is the menstrual phase. So we want to think a little bit about the structure of the wall of the uterus, which we have probably not seen yet. So the uterus is a muscular organ, has a muscle layer of the myometrium. You don't need to worry about that for your exam, but if you had uteri you could have observed in lab, you would have seen it. That's what you would have been touching. And then we have an endometrial layer, so endo inside, right? So this would be like inside the uterus. We also have a thin uterine lining. So we're going to see changes in thickness of the endometrium and kind of the structures we see within the endometrium across the uterine cycle. But I don't want you to think that that's actually what's getting shed. It's not the endometrium itself that's getting lost. It's just this little lining. So that would be like, if you were at the perspective of the inside of the uterus, that would be the most superficial layer. If we're thinking inside to out, we'd have that uterine lining, then the endometrium, then the myometrium. So the menstrual phase, we see the shedding of this thin uterine lining. And we start to see blood flow to the tissue overall decreasing. Okay? So we see blood flow to the endometrium decreasing. That's why we see these shrinking little blood vessels in our image. And we can see that the endometrial thickness is decreasing during this phase as a result. So what's happening when we see blood is we're seeing this tissue, this uterine lining pulling away and coming out. So that's the part that you lose, and that's going to get regenerated. So that's what the actual menstrual flow is. It's that uterine lining being lost. So this is under hormonal control. So this is going to be triggered by decreased levels of estrogens and progesterone, which were the hormones that were being released by the corpus luteum. So by the luteal phase of that previous menstrual cycle. So at the beginning of the follicular phase, we've just had the corpus luteum die off. So we're going to see low levels of estrogens and progesterone. That's what that gland was releasing. And that's what triggers the menstruation. So next we move into the proliferative phase. So the proliferative phase is during that second part of the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. So we're still seeing developing follicles within the ovaries. And what the uterus is doing is preparing for a potential fertilization event, right? So before ovulation, the uterus is preparing the endometrium and the lining. So it's creating a new lining, right? So a new lining within the uterus. The endometrial layer itself is growing. So it's thickening, right? We can see it physically getting larger. We can see that there's more blood flow here. We're also going to see that, not pictured, glands within the endometrium are enlarging. We're going to see a smooth layer of the uterus start to thicken as well during this phase. And the cervical glands, which are like the exit to the uterus, is the cervix. There are glands within the cervix, and they're going to start to secrete mucus, which is going to help with sperm motility, moving sperm towards an egg cell after ovulation. So we're preparing to potentially care for a growing embryo should fertilization occur. That's what the proliferative phase is about. It has to happen before ovulation because we want those tissues there to take care of a fertilized egg if we get one. So the hormonal control for this is estrogen. So the estrogen from the Corpus luteum has degenerated, but as we have those developing primordial follicles and those developing eggs, as we have a maturing follicle, those follicles are then producing some estrogen. So our estrogen levels are kind of going back up, and that's what's stimulating this development. Then we enter the secretory phase. So the endometrium is all ready for implantation. The secretory phase happens right after ovulation. So we're ready for the implantation of a fertilized egg and growth of an embryo. So we've had increased blood supply. We're going to have glands enlarging. We're going to have glycogen-rich fluids getting secreted from those glands that started growing during the proliferative phase. And that's basically to provide energy, right, for a fertilized egg to start to divide and form an embryo should we have implantation occur. The cervical secretions that began during the proliferative phase to help with sperm motility are going to get stickier. They're going to form a plug on the cervix, and this is to sort of protect against bacteria and pathogens, again, should we have a fertilized egg implant in the walls of the uterus. So here we can see these pieces mapped together. So we can see that follicular phase mapping on to menstruation and the proliferative phase all the way up to ovulation. And then we see the luteal phase. So we continue that growth. We have good blood supply. We have the glands producing that glycogen-rich fluid. As that corpus luteum degenerates, right, it's degenerating because fertilization has not occurred. That gland would stay nice and large if fertilization has occurred. So we see dropping hormones as that gland degenerates, which is how we loop back into the menstrual phase. We can look directly at the hormones now. So all of this is modulated by these hormonal changes during the menstrual cycle. So we want to be able to map each of them. So we're going to start out with the estrogen. So here we see we're starting at the beginning of the follicular phase on the x-axis here, and we're ending at the end of the luteal phase. So we can see when we start the follicular phase, we have low levels of estrogen, right? but throughout that follicular phase, they're going to be rising, right? So they're rising. During the follicular phase, they're being produced by the follicles themselves. We see a slight drop off here. And then we're going to see that the corpus luteum takes over producing that estrogen. So we see a second rise. So we have kind of two humps in the levels of estrogen throughout the menstrual cycle. This is a little different than what we see with our progesterone. So progesterone during the whole follicular phase is low. It's lower than the estrogen level, and it's just staying kind of flat. This is because those follicles, they're not producing progesterone, they're only producing the estrogen. So the progesterone is going to kick off as the corpus luteum forms. So this dotted line is ovulation. So the corpus luteum forms, it starts to secrete both estrogen and progesterone. And we can see that at its peak, it's actually producing more progesterone than estrogen. Right? So the progesterone levels really take over in the middle of that luteal phase, but then we can see that they also drop off more steeply. So often we think about this progesterone as being particularly important for triggering menstruation. And when people talk about like PMS or other disorders, they're often talking about like responses to these changes in progesterone, because we see these dramatic changes potentially. So the other things that we might be tracking are the hormones coming out of our anterior pituitary gland, which we talked about way back in AMP1. So we have LH and FSH that we particularly want to track. So they're coming from the anterior pituitary. And what we can see, right, is that they both spike right before ovulation. So that's really the important part about the LH and the FSH. We really think of the LH as being the trigger for ovulation. So you can see that that peak is happening right before our dotted line for ovulation. So that's our trigger point. The FSH is doing something similar, but we can also see changes in the FSH levels early in the follicular phase, because this is also involved with the development of those developing follicles. But remember, those developing follicles are also secreting inhibin, which is dropping those FSH levels down as well. So LH, if you're going to remember the trigger, what you want to remember is LH is the trigger for ovulation, and FSH is kind of involved with the development of the follicles. So the other thing we want to notice is kind of the relationship between these two graphs during the luteal phase. So during the luteal phase, we can see we have relatively high levels of the estrogen and the progesterone. We had a peak in LH and we had a peak in FSH. And then we have a drop off, right? So to make a peak, you have to have a spike. We also have to have a drop on the other side. So the reason for that drop is itself these rising levels of estrogen and progesterone. So the estrogen and the progesterone are inhibiting the release of LH and FSH. So that's why we see this declining. And we have relative low points of LH and FSH at the end of the luteal phase. Next, we have one of our favorites. We have some graphs, some flow charts. Okay. So here we're tracking. I want to point out what's happening. We want to pay attention to what phase we're thinking about, because during different phases, we're going to have different cell types doing different things. So the flow charts for our hormones might look a little different. So this is the early to mid follicular phase. So mapping onto the development of several of those primordial follicles. And if we're thinking about the uterus, we're thinking about that mapping on roughly to menstruation. Okay. So from the hypothalamus, we have our gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay. And that tells us to release gonadotropins from the anterior pituitary. So we're releasing FSH, we're getting higher levels of FSH, and we're getting higher levels of LH. With the FSH, if we're tracking what's happening to that and why it's going to stay kind of lower than the LH, we're thinking about the granulosa cells and the fact that they are secreting inhibin, which is acting as a negative feedback loop, but it's only affecting the FSH levels. It's not affecting the LH levels. On the other side, we can track what's happening with estrogen. So the LH secretion is affecting the theca cells, which were one of our very outer layer of cells, like outside our granulosa cells. And they're actually releasing androgens, so like testosterone androgens. These get modified by enzymes in the granulosa cells, and they get turned into estrogen, essentially. So this is kind of how those granulosa cells are releasing estrogen. So it's a response to these rising levels of LH. And this is what's creating follicular development and oogenesis, aka that first part of meiosis, that meiosis 1 that's happening in the ovary. So because we have higher estrogen, we also have higher estrogen in the blood, so you would be able to physically observe that with a blood draw. And that estrogen at the end of this loop is acting as a negative feedback loop on LH, as well as a negative feedback loop on GnRH in the hypothalamus. This is what's happening during the early to mid follicular phase. So here's a nice little table just letting you know what the actions of our various estrogens are. So estrogens can do a lot of different things. We focus on what they're doing during the follicular phase, what they're doing as relates to the development of ova, but they also have actions during pregnancy itself. So the estrogens are also going to be responsible for growing duct tissue and fat in the breasts for lactation. They're going to suppress lactation until birth. They're going to be acting on prolactin secretion, growth and contractility of the uterine smooth muscle, so its ability to squeeze. It's going to be acting on oxytocin. It's going to be promoting fluid retention. Back to our hormone flowcharts. So during the later parts of the follicular phase, we're going to see a different response to estrogen. So that's why we want to divide these two from each other. So we still have a little bit of GnRH secretion from the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary is still releasing some LH, super important because that's going to trigger ovulation, but also some FSH. The granulosa cells are releasing estrogen, but now during the late follicular phase, this is acting as positive feedback. And remember, positive feedback is the type of feedback we talk about less. Negative feedback kind of turns off a signal, but positive feedback, like we saw with clotting, is that kind of runaway snowball effect. So it's this positive feedback that's really causing that LH surge, so that like sudden spike. But then as we start to think about the luteal phase, we're thinking about progesterone. So progesterone is involved in the conditions of the uterus during the secretory phase. It's suppressing some uterine contractions. It's also promoting glandular tissue, and it's also acting on milk production. So new flow chart for the luteal phase. You can see, even though we've been doing some negative feedback loop, the hypothalamus is still producing some gonadotropin releasing hormone. We're still producing a little bit of FSH and LH, right? These never went away, they started to go down. So this is where the role of the corpus luteum is really important. So it's producing inhibin, right? And inhibin is why we ultimately see these spikes in LH and FSH goes down. So FSH mainly, which goes the farthest down, and the negative feedback loop for LH is on the other side. But we have these spikes, negative feedback loops during the luteal phase. Suppress them. It's also producing estrogen, which increases plasma estrogen, and it's secreting progesterone, which is doing that other negative feedback loop on the LH secretion. We also have long-term regulation of female reproductive function. So we have this roughly 28-day cycle happening throughout adult life. But we also have changes before puberty, during puberty, and then after. We know that after the sort of adult reproductive life in women, we lose that reproductive capacity. So we have menopause later on. So during puberty, many of these changes are happening in response to estrogen. So these estrogen levels are rising, and these are what are producing secondary sex characteristics. So the widening of the hips, the growth of breasts, growth of the hips and the buttocks happening in relationship to estrogen. There are also changes in skin oil, changes in body hair, and growth of bones. So a growth spurt is partially happening in response to estrogen. And then during the reproductive years, those estrogen levels remain high, partially because of these cycles that we are talking about related to the menstrual phases themselves. And also, this is functioning to maintain these secondary sex characteristics. So during menopause, at the end of the reproductive years, we no longer have these developing follicles. So we no longer see these levels of estrogen being produced, because part of them were being produced by the ovaries, by these follicles. So during menopause, we see estrogen levels decrease. So we actually see some body changes during menopause. So some of these secondary sex characteristics are going to start to regress, going to start to die off. We're going to see physical changes. One of the physical changes that your patients may most notice is hot flashes, so changes in sort of temperature regulation sensation. But we're also going to see changes to bone, increasing risk of osteoporosis. We're also going to see increased risk of heart disease. So these hormonal changes do impact other tissues in the body as well. So as we go through and review, we're going to want to compare how oogenesis and spermatogenesis are the same and how they differ. And as we map those two together, will hopefully help us understand both reproductive systems a little bit better than trying to key us in that. But actually, I think this is a good place to stop from a content level. So next time on Friday, we'll go through fertilization, implantation, and pregnancy. So go ahead and try to start to make some of those comparisons between the male reproductive system and the female in your mind. And then we'll talk about growth of an embryo on Friday. That'll be our last lecture.